chapter 13. If you are using the Tanya book, then it's on page 56. We're in the middle of understanding the nature of the Beinoni. That's been the focus of this chapter, and we're making progress. We're making progress through this section. So what is a Beinoni? Well, we've discovered that a Beinoni is a person who still has a spiritual struggle to deal with, but it's a very different spiritual struggle to the rest of us. We've also realized that a Beinoni is so impressive that from our perspective, if we had to meet a Beinoni, there's a pretty good chance that we would think that they are a tzaddik. So what distinguishes the Beinoni from the tzaddik, and this is really what we've been focusing on the last few weeks, is the fact that the Beinoni still has a part of their system, a part of their character, a part of their mindset that is misaligned, or at least has the potential to be misaligned. In other words, in simple English, they could still have those tempting thoughts, they could still have those distractions that the rest of us battle with. The only difference is that the Beinoni is much better than most of us at shutting it down. And therefore, in practice, the Beinoni is always going to do what they should, because they know how to shut down the problems as soon as the problems arise. Now, one of the interesting things that we said is that to understand the Beinoni and why the Beinoni is not a tzaddik, if you remember, we spoke about the concept of the essence. So we said that the Beinoni is able to control the garments of the soul, which are thought and speech and action. That means to make sure that the garments of the soul are never abused, or in modern language would say they're never hacked by the bad guys. So that means that nobody can ever take control of the Beinoni's thoughts in a long-term fashion and cause the Beinoni to meditate on or entertain negative thoughts. And the same thing applies with speech, and the same thing applies with action. That's really the greatness of the Beinoni, is that the Beinoni is never susceptible to actually falling into the trap of all of the vices that affect the rest of us. But the essence, that's what we discussed last time, the essence of the animal soul, which is by definition lazy, distracted, self-interested, or whatever it is, in other words, not aligned with what Hashem wants, the essence of the negative inside that soul is not fundamentally shifted in the case of the Beinoni. Okay, so that's where we are at the moment. And today we're going to develop that idea further, and we're going to borrow a phrase that you may remember, and we've discussed it previously, a phrase from the story of the pre-birth story of Yaakov and Esav. So remember what happened? You have their mother, Rivka, who is pregnant. She doesn't know at the time that she's pregnant with twins. And she believes that there's some kind of a conflicted individual developing inside of her, because whenever she would pass by a holy place, there'd be activity, as if the baby was attracted to whatever holiness was there. And whenever she passed a place of pagan worship, there was activity, as if the baby was attracted to that. And so she felt, what is this? What kind of a child do I have that's going to be so, split personality? And so she goes at the time to the prophet, and she asks the prophet for an explanation, help me come to terms with this mishugas that's going on inside of me. And he says to her, you have to realize this is not a single baby with a split personality, but there's twins. And not only are there twins, but these two twins are the potential or the future fathers of two massive superpower nations. And the nature of these nations is Ula'oim mila'oim ye'emot, which means that the one nation is always going to struggle for supremacy over the other nation. So in understanding that statement, Ula'oim mila'oim ye'emot, that the one is going to struggle against the other, so the sages tell us what that means is Keshezeh kam, zeh noifel. It's what we call the seesaw principle. Keshezeh kam, zeh noifel. When the one rises, the other one must fall. And that's a fascinating insight, because essentially that tells us that as long as Yaakov is dominant, Esav is disempowered, and as long as Esav has power, Yaakov is in trouble. That's basically what it means. Because when the one rises, the other one falls. Let's take a moment just to observe in the story itself, and the characters of the story. So we know the characters, right? We know Yaakov and we know Esav. If you had to describe in a phrase, in a line, even in a word, who Yaakov is, and then describe who Esav is, what would you say are the things that best capture these two personalities, Yaakov and Esav? It's an uncomfortable silence.
Yaakov follows Torah and
One was a
Esau
Torah
follows the
scholar, the
wild
other
side.
one was a hunter.
Okay, so there you go. So Yaakov is a so-called Torah scholar, and I'm saying so-called only because the Torah wasn't given yet. So that means that Yaakov is completely dedicated to know and to learn and to discover and to commit himself to whatever Hashem says. But we've got to use the word Torah there with a little bit of flexibility because the Torah isn't yet presented to the world. So we do know that these great individuals, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and so forth, they were able to access the Torah even before it was given, but it was a completely different experience of learning Torah to what our experience is. So you'd say that Yaakov is the scholar who's dedicated to Torah learning, and Esav is he's a wilde chaya, quite frankly. You know, he's a wild person, a brute. And that would be correct. Another way that we could divide Yaakov and Esav is the distinction between materialism and holiness. In other words, Yaakov values holiness. That doesn't mean to say that he runs away from the world and he doesn't engage the world, because we know that that's not Yaakov's story. We know that at some point he actually becomes a very, very successful, wealthy man. So in order to focus on holiness does not mean that you have to shun the world. But his value is the value of holiness. And anything that the world has to offer is a tool or resource that he could use in order to create more holiness. So when Yaakov becomes a really wealthy man, what's the point of that wealth? When Yaakov is a wealthy man, there's going to be more holiness in the world. That's what's going to happen. So he's going to imbue a holy message or a holy purpose to every asset that he has. Esav, by contrast, his first love is materialism. So yes, Esav will do certain things which are moral or which have a spiritual value. So for example, he'll be an exceptional son and he'll treat his father with a level of respect that puts him on a pedestal, which is obviously a positive thing. But what's his first love? What does he care about? What does Esav live for? He lives for materialism. So if Esav is going to become a very wealthy man, that will be so that Esav could be a very wealthy man. In other words, what's his motivation for material success is in order that he should be materially successful. So these are the two forces that are inside of Rivka. And these two forces represent a lot more than just two individuals or even two nations. These two forces represent the two consciousnesses that we have in our lives of what life is all about. There's a part of us inside of ourselves that anytime there's something holy, it's magnetized, it's drawn to whatever is holy, and it wants to participate, and wants to have that experience. And there's another part of ourselves that anytime there's an opportunity for something materialistic, it wakes up, and it chases, and it wants to be part of that materialistic experience. And any one of us could, at some point, especially this time of the year when we're supposed to be quite introspective, we could look at ourselves in the mirror and say, well, who's the real me? Am I somebody who values and cares about holy and spiritual and godly things? Or am I somebody who cares about brand label clothing and fancy cars? Who am I? And in the same way as Rivka goes to the prophet to say what's going on inside me, every single one of us goes to say what's going on inside me. They're two forces. And the rules are the same, just as Yaakov and Esav, neither one can, well, let's put it this way. The two of them cannot share dominance simultaneously. If one of them is dominant, by nature, that means that the other one is somehow subservient. In other words, you can't have a world that is run by Esav characters and simultaneously is run by Yaakov characters. It doesn't work. They have completely different worldviews. They have completely different priorities. They have completely different definitions of success and value, etc. It's exactly the same internally. If I allowed my materialistic side to take precedence, the natural consequence of that is my spiritual side is going to weaken. Whereas if I prioritize my spiritual side and I invest in my spiritual side and I speak the language of my neshama, then what I'm going to find is that my material side is going to weaken. And by the way, and it's only because it's this time of the year, so it's an appropriate exercise to do. When Yom Kippur comes, I don't know who you spend time with in the days running up to Yom Kippur, but I could tell you this. It's absolutely predictable, like clockwork, that the closer we get to Yom Kippur, the more frequently the messages come through to the rabbi, what am I supposed to do about fasting? And everybody has a reason why they can't fast. This one has low blood sugar, and that person's on a specific kind of a medication, and they're not sure if they can skip it for a day, so they haven't yet checked with the doctor, but maybe the rabbi, And this person is expecting a baby. And they're all valid reasons. But what that represents, which I think is really fascinating, is there's this shared collective sense of anxiety around a fast. When we know that a fast is coming, everybody's all nervous. How are we going to manage? And did you see how hot it's going to be on the day? That's when you're in the southern hemisphere. And the shul doesn't have proper ventilation. And what if the power goes out and there's no electricity, which is what happened to us last year? And, all these considerations that people are going to have you hydrated enough, and then you go to sleep at night, and suddenly you feel thirsty when you go to sleep at night because you have this anticipation. And there's all the stuff that's going on inside of our heads. Stop drinking coffee a week before, exactly. Right, really important. See, I don't think about these things. I don't drink coffee, but you got to start thinking about all these things, all these plans, and everybody's giving you a chokhmah, how many liters of water you have to drink before, and if you eat this kind of food, it absorbs liquid and retains liquid, and if you eat that kind of food, it's got slow release glucose, and all this stuff that everybody's telling us before the fast. And then on the fast itself, there are many people who spend a good chunk of the fast talking about all the food that they're going to have when they break the fast. So what are you doing for breaking the fast? What are you doing for breaking the fast? And we're going, yeah, we're doing that. This is my food. And it becomes this whole obsession with food. So I want to ask you simply, practically, really from a practical perspective, if my whole Yom Kippur is focused on how hungry or thirsty I am, or if I'm feeling lightheaded, or if what am I going to have to break the fast on, how much am I able to invest in the spirituality of the experience? Okay, practically. I'm not saying there'll be no investment, but it's going to be a distraction. There's no question. Now reverse that for a second. Imagine that somebody sits down on Yom Kippur and completely immerses in their experience. Completely. That means they sit down in their spot at shul, and they take the machzor, and they close their eyes and anchor themselves and focus on the davening, shut out the noise, and actually work through a meditative process of feeling completely connected to the spirituality of the experience. Is that person going to feel hungry? No. Because you'll get so caught up in what you're doing, and it will be so immersive, and it will be so compelling, and it will be so powerful that you'll forget about the fact that you're hungry. And if you think that is impractical, we know that happens because it happens to us on a regular basis. If, for example, a person is busy with a very big or important project and they've got to give a lot of time and energy to that project, they might turn around at some point and say, oh, I forgot to eat today. Can happen. That is kishazeh kam, zeh noifel, when the one ascends, the other descends. So if my hunger is the dominant force in my life, then my neshama is going to lag behind. And if my neshama becomes the dominant force in my life, then my hunger is going to dissipate. And that's how we have to approach Yom Kippur, is to say, you know what, rather than worrying and fretting over the fact that we may not eat, let's rather focus on getting in touch with our neshama. Now that's going to be really valuable to understanding what goes on with the Beinoni, because the Beinoni is the person who is constantly experiencing at a very deep inner level, because it's not at a surface level where right now I have to make a decision. Do I do X or do I do Y? Because as we've already identified, the Beinoni never gets to that point. But internally there's a whole lot of stress and there's a whole lot of conflict that's going on, and we need to understand the nature of that conflict. So on page 56, so where are we? Let's go here. That's what the last thing we said was about davening. So that puts us 2, 4, 6, about 10 lines or so from the bottom of the page, if you're looking at the book. And if you're looking on the screen, sorry, I've gone down a little bit too far over here. Va'af. Okay, so the line starts with the word v'kayoytze, and we're starting on the third word of the line. So we've discussed the possibility that when a Beinoni is in a very meditative experience of davening, at that point they will taste what it's like to be a tzaddik, because they'll feel this overwhelming sense of the neshama, and as a result, all the negativity and all the distraction is going to recede into the background, exactly in the same way as we could do over Yom Kippur if we completely immerse ourselves in the Yom Kippur davening, not watching the clock, not seeing how many pages are left in the machzor. I remember as a kid always sitting with two fingers, one finger where we are and one finger where it's going to end, and that's the most painful way to go through the davening. So if a person is completely immersive, we know what's going to happen. We are going to feel less concern for our hunger or our weakness or whatever the case is, and much more of a sense of connection. Now, the Beinoni achieves that in the course of a regular davening. However, even when that happens for the Beinoni, what that means is that at that time, the neshama has taken control. And there's a very big difference between taking control or actually shifting something fundamentally. So again, let's go back to our Yom Kippur experience. Let's say that you come to Yom Kippur and you completely immerse yourself and you invest deeply in the experience, and you find that this is the most wonderful Yom Kippur you've ever had. You didn't notice the passage of time, and you didn't feel the pangs of hunger, and you didn't have that little mid-afternoon tremble that you normally get, or whatever it is, and you completely immersed in the experience. And because you're so immersed in the experience, you're switched on to all of the messaging of Yom Kippur and the inspiration of Yom Kippur, and you feel quite elevated, and it can happen. It could be a real thing. You could feel very, very elevated. The greatest disappointment that can happen to somebody who has that experience is what happens as soon as Yom Kippur ends. I often think about this. At the end of Yom Kippur, we do Ne'ilah. And Ne'ilah is this very powerful, uplifting prayer. And the crescendo of Ne'ilah is the whole community shouting together these declarations of faith in Hashem, Shema Yisrael, and Hashem Hu Ha'elekim. It's very powerful and very moving. And you could almost feel during that crescendo of Ne'ilah, you could almost feel like you've been teleported out of your body and you're having an angelic experience, right? And then, shortly after that, you get home. You get home for a ritual that we call breaking of the fast. And maybe a more accurate term would be breaking of the inspiration. Because all of the great elevation that we experience during the course of Yom Kippur can dissolve in one bite of whatever it is we're breaking the fast on. And suddenly you realize none of that was real. None of that was me. This is me. Me is the person who wants a second helping of dessert. That's the real me. Now, that's not necessarily accurate. In fact, it's probably more accurate to say that during Rosh Hashanah we get a taste of who we really are, and the rest of the year we're living with all the external layers. But what we can say in context of what we're learning over here is that we experienced shlita. There was a moment where our spiritual, holy, godly side took control, but it didn't change the other side of who we are. Therefore, as soon as it relinquishes control, because now Ne'ilah is over and I've closed the book and I've gone back home, okay, so at this point in time, the ogre is back. Now the Beinoni has a similar experience in the course of regular davening, not only on a day like Yom Kippur. Just pause for a second because there's a question over here, and that is, what do you do if the decorum in shul is not good during davening? Now this is a very important question. What do you do if the decorum in shul is not good during davening? So there are a few things that you could do. The first thing that you could do is you could obviously shout at everybody around you and tell them that they need to be quiet because you're trying to daven. But the likelihood is that A, it's not going to go down very well, and B, it's probably not going to be very effective. So what else can you do? And elsewhere in Tanya, quite a bit later on, the Alter Rebbe gives us, it's in a different context, but he essentially says this. Part of the discipline and part of the growth that we're expected to try and achieve is if there is a disturbance or a distraction, I should take that as a signal to get more involved in the davening. Even though my reaction, my knee-jerk reaction is going to be to shout or to protest or shush somebody or whatever the case is, but actually what's much more effective is to immerse myself properly into the davening experience. And he goes so far to say later on in Tanya that Hashem obviously orchestrates what's going to happen around me. And if Hashem has put me in a place where there is noise and distraction around me, it's because Hashem is giving me a push that I need to immerse deeper into my davening. So that's not an easy pill to swallow, but the message really is, I can't change other people, but I could completely change my reality. And so therefore what I need to do is focus myself and invest myself. Okay? So that's an answer to that question. Let's come back to the Beinoni. So how do we know that the Beinonis, or where do we see the concept that the Beinonis experience is, now I'm davening and I'm really focused and I'm immersed and I'm having this deep experience and I feel what it's like to be a tzaddik, hasn't actually shifted who I am on the inside. That brings us to the verse that we already quoted. Like the pasuk says, the verse says, Ulo'oim milo'oim yemotz, that the one superpower is going to struggle for supremacy against the other superpower. In the verse, it's talking about Yaakov and Esav as they are babies, fetuses inside their mother's womb. But the Gemara, as I mentioned, explains that what that means is kishazekam zenoifel, that what it's describing is the interrelationship between these two entities, or between these two perspectives, the Yaakov and the Esav reality, that when the one ascends, the other one must descend. It's the seesaw principle, and they cannot both share dominance simultaneously. And it makes absolute sense, because just think about it this way: you cannot run in two directions. It's that simple. Running is a very dynamic experience. Running is an experience that gets you places in a short period of time. So therefore it implies a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of movement. You cannot run in two directions. So I can't be enthusiastic about two opposite things at the same time. It just doesn't make any sense. I can't run after and pursue material values and simultaneously believe that I'm becoming a holier person. It just doesn't make any sense. But if I pursue and prioritize holy values, I may have material things, but I won't become a materially oriented person, because you can't run in two opposite directions. So now let's understand what that means. You'll notice, by the way, that when, I'm just going to go back a drop, he says, when he's describing the dominance of the neshama, that if the neshama is on the ascendancy, then the other side, which is the animal soul, will fall. There he's happy to say the word fall, because we're all quite comfortable with the idea that we want our neshama to become the dominant force, and we're quite happy for the nefesh habamis, the animal soul, to fall by the wayside, or at the very least recede into the background. But when he gives the other side of the equation, look what he does over here. But when the other side has dominance, the Esav side, which is the animal side, which is the Klippa side, which is the dark side, chule, etc. The Alter Rebbe doesn't want to say the words ze noifel. He doesn't want to spell out the possibility of the neshama having some kind of a trip, some kind of a fall, some kind of a misstep. He doesn't want to say that. And that's a really valuable lesson for us. It's a general lesson and it's a specific lesson. It's a general lesson about how cautious we should be about the things that we say. The Gemara spends a lot of time discussing this in the tractate Pesachim, talking about how we have to be so careful what we say, because what we say has an effect on what's going on around us. It has an effect on us. So we've got to be careful not to say negative things. But also more specifically, it's an inappropriate thing for us to suggest that our neshama could fall. We shouldn't even talk that way. And again, it's such a relevant concept as we go into Yom Kippur, because in the process of being introspective over Yom Kippur, we may think that there is a value in knocking ourselves, saying, well, maybe I've fallen and maybe I've disconnected from Hashem, and all the things that people may do in their self-talk that sounds very religious and sounds very aligned with the process of Teshuvah. And so it's important for us to know over here, you don't say that. Don't speak negatively about the neshama. It's fair to say, I haven't been as committed to my neshama as I should be. It's fair for a person to say, I haven't been in touch with my neshama to the extent that I need to be. But for a person to suggest, God forbid, that there's any weakness or negativity in the neshama itself, don't go there. Don't even say such things. Okay, so let's understand what it means in practical terms for the Beinoni. When the Beinoni is in a state of meditative connection to Hashem through davening, during that time, the godly soul is able to overwhelm and overcome the nefesh habamis, the animal soul. And again, this is not far-fetched for us. It's not so foreign. It could happen to us for real in our lives. And maybe it has happened. We could become so entrenched, so enmeshed, so immersed in an experience of holiness that we actually feel my nefesh habamis is not bothering me. There are no distractions right now. I'm really focused. Or as we'd say in today's world, I'm in the zone. So if we could have that experience, the Beinoni certainly could have that experience. Now we take a moment just to describe the mechanics of how this works. And this is really, really interesting because first it's interesting to understand how it works. And secondly, it's also interesting for us because it gives us mechanics. And when we understand the mechanics of something, we can actually use this. Here's a technique. He's essentially showing us a technique, which is B'mekor ha'gevuros shehi bina. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The technique is to meditate on Hashem's greatness, Ein Sof Baruch Hu, and how Hashem is completely infinite. Because that will stimulate an incredibly powerful burning love of Hashem in the spiritually healthy part of the heart. Okay, so let's understand what he said over here. He uses an expression, Mekor HaGevuros Shehi Bina. So we need to understand what that means. Why are we even having this conversation? Because he's just used the word misgaberes. Okay, so let's check our understanding of these words before we go any further. What does the word gevura mean? Or in the verb over here, which is misgaber or misgaberes, or what does it mean as an adjective when we say gibor? What do any of those words mean? Strong, exactly. Okay, so Gibor is somebody who is really powerful. That's why in modern Hebrew they use the word Gibor to represent a hero, because that implies somebody who has tremendous amount of physical strength or strength of character. That's how it becomes a hero. So Gibor is somebody who is powerful. Therefore, Gevura is power. So now what is the verb misgaber, coming from the root of Gevura, right? So what would the verb misgaber mean? To overcome, right? To overpower would be the correct translation, right? Yeah. To overpower, because gevura is power, so misgaber is to overpower. Now, if there's a conflict, and there's a good person and a bad person, and we don't have to get into all the details of the conflicts that are currently represented by the good people and the bad people, and unfortunately the people who can't tell the difference. But if you have somebody who is a law-abiding citizen and you have somebody else who is a criminal, and the criminal, God forbid, is intending to harm a law-abiding citizen, so what you need is the law-abiding citizen has to be misgaber. They have to show force. They have to be able to overpower the assailant, the perpetrator, the criminal. That's what has to happen. You have to be misgaber. You need to find strength inside of yourself that is greater than the strength of the person who's trying to cause harm. In the same way, if the nefesh habahamis, the animalistic soul, is trying to cause harm, which basically means to draw and suck the person down into a place of things which are misaligned with Hashem or toxic behaviors, etc. So I need something inside of me that is misgaber, that can overpower that nefesh habahamis, that animal soul. And at first brush you'd think, wow, that's going to be really difficult, because if we're using the metaphor of an animal to describe that soul, the implication is that it's very powerful. In our experience, animals are stronger than humans. So how will I be misgaber? What kind of force do I have inside of myself to be able to overcome? So let's say, for argument's sake, and this is an extreme example, but the extreme example will illustrate the point. So let's say that you've got somebody, let's say you've got one of those young, energetic, wild horses, and you need to break in the horse because you want to be able to use it to ride on. So there's no question about it that the horse is more powerful than the human. There's no question. So how's the human going to be misgaber? How's the human going to overcome the horse? Training, okay? Training, right? And what is training? Is training the use of force? So what is it? Okay, so you're going to have to do something to break in the horse. That's true. It's part of the training. What is training? Repetition. Okay, and how do you know what to repeat? Let's bring the question from a different angle. What strength do humans have that animals lack? Intelligence. Developed intelligence. So therefore, what's that? Control. But I'm saying, what gives me that control? What? So what gives me that control? What allows me to train the animal? What? Intelligence. I have to outsmart the animal in order to overpower the animal, because physically I can't overpower the animal. It's not going to happen. So I need to outsmart the animal. That's why he says over here that Mekor HaGevuros, the root of Gevura, is Bina, is understanding. Right? The root of true power is intellectual, not physical. And that's an axiom for life. Because what we know very, very well is that those who are stronger are not always those who are victorious. What do they say? You've got to play smart, not hard. You've got to be able to outsmart the enemy, outmaneuver the enemy. Because most conflicts are not fair. Most times the criminal or the terrorist element has power that we can't use. That's what makes it so difficult to deal with crime or to deal with terror. Because we're not willing to do the things that they are willing to do. So in other words, we're not going to walk around with a stick of dynamite or some kind of a hand grenade and say, okay, if you're coming in close, I'm going to blow everybody. That's not how we think. So the power that the negative has in terms of brute force is greater. The power that we have is the power to outsmart. So for example, in martial arts, one of the key things that you often learn in martial arts is you use your opponent's body and their weight and the movement of their body against them. That's where power comes from. So you're not necessarily stronger than your opponent. That's actually your strength. The fact that your opponent is so strong becomes your strength because now you're using their strength against them. So what is Mekor HaGevuros? What is the root of true strength? Bina, understanding. If you understand the situation, you understand how to manipulate the situation in your favor, you understand how to use the assets that you have at your disposal or even the assets that the other person has, then you have power. The same thing occurs in the conflict between the neshama and the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. The animal soul has much more brute force in the human experience than the neshama has. Now, that's not to say that the animal soul is stronger than the neshama, but in our conscious human experience, the animal soul has more power, and I can prove it simply. Do you believe that in the course of Yom Kippur, you will at some point feel your stomach grumble? Of course, it's going to happen. Or you're going to feel that you're a little bit weak or whatever the case is. Because it's perfectly normal that in a holy environment, your nefesh habahamis, your animal soul, or for that matter, the body, and the two work hand in glove, are so much a part of your life, are so compelling, are so strong that their needs are going to flare up even if you're in the middle of a very focused spiritual experience. Now let's flip that for a second. If you're in the middle of the Whiskey Live Festival and you're going from place to place, you're trying this single malt and that aged whiskey and whatever. What are the chances that in the middle of that, your neshama is going to start grumbling? Quickly, I need to learn some Torah now. It's not going to happen, right? So that means that in our conscious experience, even though the neshama, needless to say, is more powerful than anything because it's chelek elokam imal mamash, as we've learned, it's a piece of Hashem. But in my experience, my lived experience, my animal soul and my bodily needs are far more powerful than the neshama. Yet, the neshama has access to bina, to understanding, not to understand the machinations of the nefesh habahamis. You see, here's a whole different story. I don't need to, in this case, understand my opponent in order to be able to outsmart my opponent. I need to understand something else. What do I need to understand? I need to understand lehisboinin begedulas Hashem ein sof baruch hu. I need to understand Hashem's greatness. That's what's going to give me the strength, the resilience, the wherewithal to be able to overcome the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, and the distractions and the needs of the body and all the things that might interfere with my spiritual development or my connection to Hashem. But the axiom is the same. Mekor HaGevuros is bina. The root of true strength is understanding. So if I understand Hashem's greatness, then I don't have to fight so hard against my nefesh habahamis, because if I understand Hashem's greatness, then I'm naturally going to gravitate towards things that will link me to Hashem. It's when I don't understand Hashem's greatness, and it's kind of just an abstract concept floating around in my head, and I know it's important, but I haven't really spent time and invested my brain space in understanding it. Well, then what do you want from me? Where am I going to find this wherewithal? Where am I going to find this resilience? It's just another thing. It's like a book on the shelf. Because when a person contemplates and meditates deeply on a concept, then it is a natural consequence that it will excite them. So if you think about something and you realize how great and how beautiful it is, then naturally what's going to happen is you're going to want it. And if that's what you want, you can't run in two directions. Now that you start running in the healthy direction, because what you love is your connection to Hashem, and that's what you want, so naturally you're not going to be, waylaid by the wishes and interests of the Nefesh HaBahamis. So that's what happens to the Beinoni in the course of davening. It's what happens to us in fleeting experiences, like, for example, at certain points on Yom Kippur. But for the Beinoni, this happens on a daily basis, possibly multiple times a day. Each time the Beinoni immerses into this experience of davening, which is a meditative experience, which allows the Beinoni to reflect on Hashem's greatness, which stimulates a very powerful love of Hashem, of the Beinoni towards Hashem. And therefore, that shuts down the Nefesh HaBahamis from causing any trouble during those periods. So now when I have this rush of incredible passion and excitement and love towards Hashem, naturally that is going to overwhelm all of the other interests that my Nefesh HaBahamis have been trying to push. So the Nefesh HaBahamis is saying, let's talk about what we're going to break the fast on. And the Nefesh HaRekis is saying, but right now is Yom Kippur. It's an opportunity to connect with Hashem in this profound way. So you know what? Let's embrace Yom Kippur. It's only once a year. It's this gift from Hashem. Let's do this. Let's get completely into it. And as that excitement and that passion and enthusiasm builds, so the Nefesh HaBahamis doesn't really have a voice anymore. But that's only while that experience is live. Only while the person is contemplating, and only while they're feeling that intense love of Hashem, which for the Beinoni is during davening. But the Nefesh HaBahamis has not become neutralized in the case of the Beinoni. It hasn't disappeared. It hasn't stepped out of its role of a Nefesh HaBahamis. It isn't now trying to be a clone of the Neshama. It's still who it is and what it is. And you know where you could see this in a really good metaphor for this is when you've got a group of people who are supposed to be working on a project together and they've kind of lost their enthusiasm. They don't think the project is going to get anywhere. And then you've got somebody who walks into the room and gives them this pep talk and says, this is amazing and we can do this and it's going to make such a difference and this team is phenomenal, right? And everybody gets switched on and their motors start running and they start producing or whatever. If that person who gave the pep talk and got them all going doesn't arrive at work the next day, there's going to be a major slump. Because the pep talk didn't change the people, it just galvanized the people in the moment. And that's exactly what's happening to the Neshama / Nefesh HaBahamis experience of the Beinoni. In the moment, this was unbelievable. I was so swept up in the emotion of the time. But once it's over, the Nefesh HaBahamis is still a Nefesh HaBahamis. It did not fundamentally change. Ela but Tzaddik, the only person who changes the Nefesh HaBahamis completely and rids it of the Yetzer Hara, which is the animal soul's inclination to do bad things, that's a Tzaddik. Shenemar boy, it's only about a Tzaddik that we say in Tehillim, and we quoted this verse all the way in the beginning in chapter 1, Velibi cholol bekirbi. Only a Tzaddik could say, my heart has become empty. What does it mean empty? Not, God forbid, empty as in the fact that the heart's not working or there's no blood or anything like that. But when he says that the heart has become empty, what he means is, I no longer have that compulsion to do things which are misaligned. That doesn't exist. It's not part of my life anymore. It's gone. And what that means is that the tzaddik actually reaches a point where the tzaddik despises things that are contrary to what Hashem wants. And Vesoinoi hates anything which is contrary to what Hashem wants. Now that's a very big statement, right? Because as we've already identified previously, we've spoken about the concept that, there's some people who say, I would love to do X, but unfortunately, never poor me, the Torah doesn't allow it. And then you get another level, which is the person who says, I don't really want to do X because the Torah doesn't allow it. And then you get the tzaddik who says, I find X disgusting because the Torah doesn't allow it. And if the Torah doesn't see a value in it, how could I possibly see a value in it? And if it stands to potentially get in the way of my relationship with Hashem, then I hate it absolutely. So that's the reality of the tzaddik. That's not the reality of the Beinoni. And just very, very, very briefly recapping something we already discussed before, and that is either betachlis hasina v'amius or shaloi betachlis hasina kanal, depending on what level the tzaddik is, the tzaddik will either have a degree of hatred and disgust at things which are interference with Hashem, or absolute hatred and disgust. But that just depends on what level of tzaddik it is. And as he says, kanal, this is something we've already discussed previously in chapter 10, so we're not going to rehash it now. Here's what we're going to wrap up with for this evening. Aval be'beinoni, the reality of the beinoni is huderech mashal ke'adam sheyoshem. The Beinoni's experience at their spiritual high points, their experience of the animal soul and of the Yetzer Hara is, it's gone to sleep. Sheyachol lachzor v'le'or mishnosoi. Anybody who is sleeping could always wake up, and you don't even necessarily know when they're going to wake up. They might surprise you. They may give the impression of being in such a deep sleep, and the next thing they're wide awake. Can happen. What's interesting about this, just to give you a little bit of a heads up, is in a few chapters' time, in chapter 19, we're also going to discuss the opposite end of the spectrum, which is where a person's neshama is the part that's asleep. So here we've got the Beinoni who's so spiritually advanced and has these deep experiences of connection to Hashem that as a result, the Nefesh HaPamis, the animal soul, is temporarily asleep. Okay? But temporarily asleep means at any time it could wake up. And likewise, whatever negativity lives within the Beinoni's character, when the Beinoni is davening, that is when the negative side is catching up on some sleep. If you think about it, it's actually a great arrangement. If I was an Nefesh HaPamis and I was trying to be able to be in a position that I could get into the head of the Beinoni, then what I'm going to want to say is, you know what, if you've got to daven, go ahead and daven. I'm not coming with tushul, I'm going to sleep. It works in both of our interests. You're going to daven, and I'm going to rejuvenate. So that's the mistake the Beinoni should never make, to think because right now I don't feel any pull or tug to do something which is against what Hashem wants. That means that I'm now immune. Forget about it. It's just sleeping at the moment. Because while the Beinoni is davening and saying the Shema and saying the Amidah, during that segment of the day, the Beinoni is so alive with this burning enthusiasm and love for Hashem that the animal soul says, I know I can't get a word in edgeways of yes, I'm just going to step back. But what could happen at any given time is it could wake up again. Now, I don't know how you wake up in the morning, but sometimes you see when kids wake up from their daytime nap, they wake up in a very grumpy mood. And it's quite possible that the animal soul could also wake up in a very grumpy mood and say, you know what, I think you've had enough time to yourself and to experience your deep meditative connection to Hashem, etc. But now I need some me time as well, and I need to be able to assert myself. And so the Beinoni has to be on guard at all times, because despite the fact that there's this period of absolute quiet, it does not mean that the problems have been resolved or neutralized, and he shouldn't think that he's out of the woods.